This man was a pilot, but little did anyone know that he would go down in history as the biggest drug smuggler in America. He managed to smuggle drugs worth $20 billion. What's even stranger is that this person didn't look like any typical smuggler, and his life was far from what one would expect of a criminal. On the contrary, he was a successful businessman, owning a large company and building genuine relationships with politicians and influential figures. There's even a photo of him with the US president at that time. How did a man like him manage to engage in drug trafficking right under everyone's noses without raising suspicion? Can you imagine that he continued smuggling drugs even during his trial, while they were discussing his smuggling charges? And astonishingly, they never noticed, and he was acquitted of all charges. Join us as we delve into the extraordinary story of the biggest drug trafficker in American history. Our story takes place in the year 1983, at the cusp of the 1980s, when drug smuggling into America was flourishing, primarily led by Colombian drug cartels, with the infamous Medellin Cartel, headed by the notorious Pablo Escobar, at the forefront. These cartels were recruiting many American citizens to work as accomplices in their drug trafficking operations. In response to the escalating drug problem, the American authorities, particularly the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, intensified their efforts and declared war against the smugglers. The American smugglers would fly their small private planes to Colombia, where they would load the drugs and then fly back to America to deliver the illicit cargo. The drugs would then be distributed and sold by drug networks within the country. The DEA identified Florida as a key gateway for most drug imports due to its proximity to Colombia. The small planes used by the smugglers couldn't fly long distances due to their limited fuel capacity, so they had to take the shortest route possible, which was the path between Florida and Colombia. The DEA closely monitored the activities of the smugglers and began noticing a distinctive pattern among them. They were often seen wearing gold chains, expensive watches, and similar outfits, indicating a uniform style among these traffickers. The DEA targeted these smugglers and successfully apprehended many of them. The number of operatives they had in Florida was larger than in any other place. To further combat drug smuggling, the DEA established a massive surveillance network, including ground-based radar systems and aerial radar-equipped planes that conducted continuous patrols around the clock. Even the U.S. Navy contributed by using radar-equipped warships to monitor the coastal areas from where the smugglers would take off. Thus, the DEA was covering land, air, and sea, making it increasingly challenging for the smugglers to operate. And to counter the DEA's strategies, some smugglers adopted more cunning tactics, but the intense campaigns of the police were closing in on them more and more. Instead of arresting the smugglers immediately upon discovery, the DEA allowed them to continue their activities while closely monitoring their operations. This strategy led the DEA to uncover not just the smugglers, but also the drug dealers within the country. By apprehending both the smugglers and the dealers in one blow, they could seize the drugs and even the profits earned from selling them all at once. And because of these fierce campaigns by the authorities, many smugglers were caught or stopped their activities permanently. But one man dared to challenge the entire system. He managed to smuggle a much larger quantity of drugs than any other smuggler, with a shipment valued in the billions. This man employed exceptionally clever methods to evade the extensive security radar network. The DEA knew of his existence but couldn't track him down or arrest him. Despite allocating a special pursuit force to him, his case remained their biggest priority because he was accomplishing what dozens of smugglers were doing. So, who is this man? How did he carry out his activities? And how did he manage to remain hidden from their sight for so long? The reason that made this task challenging for them was that they were searching in the wrong place. This smuggler was not operating in Florida, and he did not fit the typical profile of regular smugglers. The man is Rik Luytjes, and he was, in fact, a businessman and seemingly a law-abiding citizen. He lived in the city of Scranton, Pennsylvania. He seemed to live such a quiet life, that no one would ever imagine that he was a drug trafficker. What helped Rik was his expertise and knowledge as a pilot and aviation engineer of the highest caliber. He had been obsessed with aviation since he was a young child. Imagine that he obtained a pilot's license while he was still in high school. He then attended aviation college, where he studied everything about flying, from piloting aircraft to engineering them, becoming a true aviation expert. After graduating, he became a specialized professor in aviation. Shortly after that, he started his own venture and established a company called Air America. This company specialized in modifying small private aircraft, like the ones you see now. The modifications included increasing fuel tank capacity to extend the aircraft's range without frequent refueling. So instead of flying only 1,000 kilometers, after modifications, it could fly twice the distance. Of course, with increased fuel tank capacity, the aircraft's weight increased, necessitating modifications to the wings and strengthening them, and sometimes requiring changes to the wheels and engines. Rik and his company executed these modifications with professionalism and precision, gaining a strong reputation and considerable fame. The business thrived, yielding substantial profits, and this granted Rik a high social status and the opportunity to befriend important people in society. He established connections with police leaders and the state governor, and even had multiple meetings with them to discuss business and possible developments in the city. Rik started attending important events and gatherings, and as we mentioned earlier, he even met the former US president at one of these occasions. He became a significant figure in the community, and everything seemed to be going well from all angles until the year 1980. In that year, a severe economic crisis hit the world, affecting America in particular. At that time, Rik's company faced significant challenges as their regular clients, business owners, and entrepreneurs suddenly disappeared. Instead, a new type of customer emerged, a suspicious kind that appeared to have connections with criminal gangs. These customers' requests were always dubious, asking for modifications on their planes to create hidden storage spaces where they could conceal goods without being easily detected even if the aircraft were searched. Such suspicious requests made it evident that these individuals were involved in smuggling illegal items. Rik knew that, in all likelihood, these clients were seeking to smuggle illicit goods. However, due to the financial difficulties his company was facing, he reluctantly accepted these dubious customers and performed the suspicious modifications they requested. For a period, he continued to work with these questionable clients. Imagine that on one occasion, after Rik and his staff made the requested modifications to a client's plane, the client insisted on paying the bill with illegal drugs. Rik, who was in dire need of money to pay his workers' salaries, found himself without any other choice but to accept the bag of drugs. Unknowingly, the client turned out to be an undercover police officer. As soon as he handed the drugs to Rik, they arrested him on the spot and seized the bag. Through interrogation and investigation, they realized that Rik was not a real drug dealer, but rather a struggling businessman trying to save his company by any means possible. The DEA offered him a deal. They promised to release him without imprisonment or punishment in exchange for providing information about his suspicious clients, many of whom were likely involved in drug smuggling and were using the modified planes for their illicit activities. Rik agreed to the deal, and he started informing the authorities about any suspicious individuals or activities that took place within his company. In 1981, through one of his clients, Rik got connected to a drug smuggling cartel based in Tampa, Florida. As we previously mentioned, Florida was a central hub for many of these smugglers due to its proximity to Colombia, the major cocaine-producing country. The cartel saw potential in Rik, as he possessed exceptional skills and knowledge as a pilot and engineer. Rik received an offer to become the smuggler's pilot and transporter in exchange for a substantial sum of money. Considering his company's financial crisis, Rik saw this as an opportunity to make some quick money and inject funds back into his struggling business. He agreed to work with the cartel, believing it would be a temporary venture that could help him recover financially. However, he soon discovered that many of the cartel members were not just smugglers but also drug users, which negatively affected their work ethics and operations. Even their own planes were disorganized, and he found that the additional fuel tanks were placed openly inside the aircraft cabin, and the cargo, including drugs, was scattered haphazardly around them. The cartel's main base was in Florida, a state heavily monitored by the DEA, which has numerous radar systems in place to detect suspicious aircraft movements. Despite the risks, Rik managed to avoid radar detection during his flights between Pennsylvania and Colombia, making him valuable to the drug producers in Medellin, Colombia. From the very first flight, Rik was able to skillfully avoid radar detection, making successful round trips to Florida without being caught. He undoubtedly deserved the substantial payment he received, which would greatly aid his struggling company. In total, Rik executed 3 smuggling operations with this cartel. However, he eventually decided to part ways with them due to the increasing risks and the subpar preparations of the cartel members. At that time, he felt that it might mark the end of his career in the field. Yet Rik's professionalism and precise performance compared to other smugglers caught the attention of high-ranking figures in the Colombian drug industry. A leader from the Medellin Cartel named Giorgio Coa, a close friend of Escobar, and a significant figure in the cartel who was responsible for the majority of the cocaine entering America, personally reached out to Rik. During their meeting, they talked extensively, and Rik became convinced to return to the smuggling business once again, as these figures were real drug producers and not just small-time smugglers like the ones he had worked with before. Rik knew that this was an opportunity he couldn't pass up, especially when George generously promised him millions and a life of wealth, vowing to transform his life completely. However, at the end of their meeting, George gave him a stern warning. He said, "If you ever deceive us, we will find you, and this will be your end." Despite the risks, Rik understood the dangerous world he was stepping into and was prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. His first challenge was to figure out how to make a direct flight from his city in Pennsylvania to Colombia without having to refuel, which would require Rik to make modifications to his aircraft more robust than any he had done before. Rik acquired a Cessna 310, a model he had worked with extensively in the past and knew every detail of. The aircraft's natural range was about 1,500 km, so the first step was to modify its fuel tank capacity. The original capacity was around 2,000 gallons, but Rik ingeniously increased it to 6,000 gallons, tripling the amount of fuel it could carry. This enhancement would allow the plane to cover the vast distance required for the direct flight. To avoid drawing attention from authorities, Rik knew he had to be discreet in his modifications. Unlike other smugglers, who often placed barrels of fuel inside the plane's cabin, which looked suspicious and out of the ordinary, Rik came up with a clever solution. He obtained sturdy rubber bags that could be filled with fuel, and he strategically hid them throughout the aircraft's structure. Rik made use of every available empty space in the plane's structure, storing the fuel bags in the front of the aircraft, beneath the flooring, in luggage compartments, and along the sides of the wings, and he ensured that the fuel distribution was even and balanced. He established connections that allowed the fuel to flow equally from all bags to the engines, maintaining the plane's stability during the flight. This meticulous approach not only optimized fuel consumption, but also kept the aircraft's weight properly balanced. But of course, adding all this extra fuel would increase the load on the aircraft. Rik needed to strengthen the wings and wheel struts to handle the additional weight, and he also required a more powerful engine capable of carrying the plane's heavier load and covering long distances. He completely replaced the engine and made all these modifications, ensuring everything was precisely calibrated, and the work was done flawlessly. In addition to the external modifications, Rik also made adjustments inside the aircraft. He installed a radar device that could detect other radars and aerial patrols conducted by the Drug Enforcement Administration. Rik was not only modifying the aircraft, but he was also thinking smartly and finding ways to ensure he wouldn't get caught. Furthermore, he managed to bribe a corrupt customs agent who provided him with radar locations and patrol schedules, allowing him to avoid them easily. Rik established a radio communication network along the entire route from Pennsylvania to Colombia. He used a secret code to directly communicate with the cartel, avoiding making phone calls as those communications could be monitored. Rik was intelligent and cautious. He used to calculate everything before taking any step. Throughout this period, he consistently maintained his relationship with drug enforcement agents, the very agents who had recruited him to catch suspicious clients when he was first apprehended attempting to sell drugs. He developed a close rapport with them, talking to them daily and playing the role of a cooperative person, occasionally providing them with useful information and helping them apprehend other smugglers. The agents trusted him, completely unaware that behind their backs, he was preparing for a smuggling operation larger than anything they had ever seen before. Finally, after 3 months of research and planning, Rik took his first flight and flew directly from Pennsylvania to Colombia. The journey lasted for a full 13 hours, covering a distance of 5,000 kilometers, without the need to refuel again. Upon reaching Colombia, specifically the agreed-upon location, he landed on an improvised airstrip, not a real runway, just an open field. The cartel members were waiting there, and as soon as he landed, they began loading drugs onto his plane and refueling it. While they were finishing their tasks, Rik took a moment to rest after the long flight. At the same time, he calculated the new weight of the aircraft with the additional cargo and measured the length of the makeshift runway. He knew that the heavier the plane, the longer the distance required for takeoff, so precise calculations were crucial. Unfortunately, the airstrip was not paved, and to make matters worse, there were some inclines and declines, with a cluster of trees at the end. Thus, takeoff was challenging for the aircraft initially, but as it reached the end of the makeshift runway, just as Rik had anticipated, the plane managed to take off without crashing. This was in contrast to many other smugglers whose overloaded planes crashed due to excessive weight. However, Rik's powerful new engine modification proved its effectiveness in handling the extra load. On the return journey, Rik chose a different and longer route, but it was supposed to be safer and farther away from the Drug Enforcement Administration and Border Patrol facilities with their radars. Rik was confident that he could take this route because he had ensured that the plane was stocked with even more fuel than needed. However, in the middle of the flight, the radar inside his plane alerted him that another aircraft was pursuing him. It was a Navy surveillance plane conducting border patrols. This meant he could encounter them anywhere, and if they got close, it would be the end of his journey, as they would arrest him or shoot down his plane. He had to get rid of them quickly before they closed in. The problem was that they were already on his radar, and his speed wouldn't allow him to outfly them. The only option he had was to enter a nearby thunderstorm. If Rik flew into it, the radar signals would be disrupted, giving him a chance to escape. Of course, this was a high-risk move. The choices were either spending the rest of his life in prison or facing a dangerous thunderstorm. The odds favored the storm, and that's exactly what Rik did without hesitation, hoping the Navy plane wouldn't be prepared to follow him into it. Thankfully, Rik was a seasoned pilot, perhaps the best among all the smugglers. After 2 tense hours, he successfully emerged from the storm unscathed, flying low to avoid radar detection. He then landed on an abandoned runway, only touching down briefly before taking off again. The reason behind this maneuver was to make it seem like he was taking off from that location and not arriving from a long trip from Colombia. This way, the radar signals would show him as a regular aircraft flying locally. Afterward, Rik headed to Scranton, his hometown, communicating with the control tower and officially recording his arrival as a short domestic flight within the state. This further dispelled any suspicions. Besides, there were no suspicions about local pilots in that area, as the authorities believed all the smugglers were operating in Florida, completely unaware that someone could modify a small aircraft to fly such distances. Finally, back in his hometown, Rik delivered the cargo to the local drug dealers and distributors. In exchange for this nearly 1-ton load of cocaine, he received $1 million for this one daring journey. The cartel leaders were astonished by his performance and innovative methods, which allowed him to conduct multiple smuggling operations throughout the year. On each trip, Rik would smuggle quantities of cocaine amounting to hundreds of kilograms, earning him $1 million or more each trip. As a result, he started amassing wealth beyond his wildest dreams. Surprisingly, he even expanded his operations, forming his own specialized gang and employing more pilots. The number of flights increased significantly, and everything was under his close supervision, especially the meticulous modifications made to the planes. Each aircraft he used was professionally customized, demonstrating his attention to detail and dedication to his new world. As he became more experienced in his work, Rik's cautiousness diminished. Gradually, the fear dwindles and the caution decreases. Remarkably, despite the risk associated with smuggling, Rik and his gang never lost a single flight or aircraft. Such incidents were common in the smuggling business, but Rik and his team were the exception. He had become so adept at his craft that the cartel leaders marveled at his work. They would often reward him with amounts higher than what they initially agreed upon, because Rik was genuinely saving them a lot, transporting their goods more efficiently than they ever dreamed of. Throughout this period, Rik maintained his relationships with the undercover agents from the DEA. They were unaware of his real identity as a smuggler and genuinely believed he was cooperating with them. Rik strategically selected and shared useful information that helped them but never exposed him directly. He portrayed himself as an ally within the drug cartels, gaining their trust while secretly staying one step ahead of them, all as the country's most prominent trafficker. But in 1984, disaster struck when the smuggling gang from Florida that Rik worked for in his first operation got busted, and Rik got caught along with them. In total, 15 individuals were apprehended, including Rik, and they were all sent to Florida to stand trial for their smuggling activities in the state. During the trial, Rik confessed that he did indeed carry out these smuggling operations with the gang, but he did it with the intention of cooperating with the DEA. He aimed to provide them with valuable and in-depth information about the drug smuggling movements in the country. Remarkably, Rik even convinced the DEA agents he was working with to come and testify in court on his behalf. Meanwhile, Rik had reasons to be fearful. He worried that news of the trial, his cooperation with the DEA, and his involvement in local drug smuggling activities would reach the Colombian cartels. He feared they might consider him a traitor due to his double dealing. So, in order to maintain his credibility, Rik continued to participate in smuggling operations between court sessions. He found himself on trial for smuggling while embarking on smuggling trips during the weekends. The trial lasted for 11 weeks, and during that time, Rik managed to carry out 11 smuggling trips. He earned a staggering $13 million from these trips while facing trial. Surprisingly, among the 15 defendants, he was the only one acquitted, thanks to the testimony of the DEA agents. Rik's success in the smuggling business had amassed him tens of millions, but handling such large sums required laundering. To achieve this, he sought the assistance of Michael Coffey, a banking expert who helped him transfer the money to offshore accounts outside the United States, making it appear clean. However, Rik faced a new problem when one of his pilots, a man named Jim Cooper. This pilot had returned from Colombia carrying a shipment of drugs. There was another person who was supposed to be a local distributor waiting for him at the airstrip to receive the shipment. However, by mistake, the drug dealer parked his car on the runway. When Jim attempted to land, the plane collided with the car, and the drug dealer was killed. The incident was reported, and the police arrived on the scene. They discovered the type of cargo Jim was carrying and realized he was a smuggler. He was promptly arrested, and now he is not only charged with drug smuggling, but also with unintentional murder. After the investigation was completed, Jim was given the right to make a call to anyone he wanted. The first person who came to Jim's mind was his gang leader, Rik. When Rik heard the news, he panicked, and instead of trying to calm Jim down and negotiate with him to keep quiet, he chose to completely abandon Jim, leaving him to fend for himself. Jim felt that his boss had abandoned him, and given the serious charges he was up against, he might receive a 30 or 40-year prison sentence. As a result, Jim decided to strike a deal with the authorities, offering them information about Rik and his smuggling operations in exchange for immunity. Through Jim's confessions, the authorities began taking action against Rik and his company, Air America. However, they needed more evidence to arrest Rik based solely on Jim's confession. Consequently, they conducted a thorough review of everything related to him, including his company, invoices, communications, movements, and even bank accounts. With such a massive investigation, it was expected to take some time. Rik was aware that they were investigating about him and knew that sooner or later they would arrest him. To prepare for the inevitable, he transferred around $30 million to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Believing that the Cayman Islands don't have an extradition treaty with the United States, Rik fled to the same location with his airplane. Unfortunately for him, he was wrong. The U.S. authorities were able to trace his money to the Cayman Islands and found out that he was there. They sent a report about him to the local authorities on the island. Despite the absence of any extradition treaty between them, the local authorities decided that Rik was a troublemaker and undesirable. In 1986, the local police on the island arrested Rik and handed him over to U.S. authorities. Once he was back in the United States, the investigation began, and the charges were severe, ranging from various criminal activities to a potential sentence of up to 345 years in prison. To avoid such an outrageous sentence, Rik chose to cooperate with the investigators and informed them of the location of his hidden money. They seized over $21 million in cash, and in addition to the money, he fully disclosed all his operations, providing them with detailed explanations of his criminal activities and how he ran his operations. As a result of his cooperation, Rik's sentence was reduced to just 8.5 years, which, considering his status as one of the biggest smugglers in America, was relatively short. However, it is certain that he did not reveal all the money he had hidden. After serving his sentence, he would find a substantial amount of money awaiting him. The DEA considered that the information they obtained from him was more valuable than keeping him in prison for more years. And with that, we reach the end of our story. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel.